Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Davey Peppers, and it is just lovely to be back here talking with you wonderful people. Yes, it has been a minute, but we are back in action, and at, quite frankly, the best time of the year to be back in action, because we are finally at the end of this dumpster fire garbage day of a year. And you know what the end of the year means. The end of the year means Oscars, baby. And because we are doing Oscars, that means we're talking about good movies. We're talking about dramas. We're talking about comedy dramas. We're talking about... Those are really the only two types of films that generally get a lot of Oscar consideration, so we're mostly going to focus on those. But you get the general vibe I'm going for. We are here to discuss some really interesting, really weird films. We're going to do reviews of the new film Minari, the new film Nomadland, the film available now on Amazon Prime, Sound of Metal, and then we are going to take a look at what has been going on with producing and releasing films, because there's been a lot of recent news regarding Warner Brothers, Tenet, and Mission Impossible 7. But we're going to get into that in the end. First off, let's just do some reviews. Let's talk about some movies, you know? So the first movie that we are going to discuss, as mentioned, is Minari, one of the big contenders for the eventual Oscars ceremony. This movie, written and directed by Lee Isaac Chung, is a comedy drama following a Korean family in the 1980s, led by the father of the family, Jacob, played by Steven Yeun, who has a wife named Monica, and they have 2 children. We are seeing this movie through the eyes of the youngest son, David. He's 7 years old, he has a heart murmur, he's just never really been allowed to be a kid, and when Jacob decides, hey, I'm going to move my family from California, where we had a decent life, but we were working on the line, and we'll be working on the line till the day we die. I'm going to move them to Arkansas. We got a slightly mobile home and a butt ton of land, and we are just going to make something really beautiful. We are going to make a farm. We are going to farm Korean vegetables, and I'm going to have something to be truly, truly proud of. This decision causes a lot of tension and rifts within the family that are only exacerbated when Monica's mother comes to Arkansas to live with the family because she's having some health problems. And probably the biggest central conflict of the film, outside of the general kind of, raising a family is hard, how do you balance trying to raise a family with being your own individual person and all that stuff, is the conflict between David and his grandmother, who do not get along, especially near the beginning of the film, and a lot of the movie's runtime is dedicated to these two equally mischievous and kind of carefree people finding solid ground and finding things that make their connections so strong. And that alone is a really beautiful and interesting aspect of this story to tell, but when you combine that with the half of the film following Jacob and Monica as kind of the leaders of this nuclear family, especially in regards to Steven Yeun's magnificent performance. If you haven't seen, most people probably know him from The Walking Dead, where he played Glenn and was the best character on that show and was the only reason I watched that show for like 4 seasons. But you could also see him in films like Burning and Mayhem, where he is really, really good at being an actor. So seeing him in a role that is, much like his role in Burning, extremely understated and extremely powerful, which is probably the hardest type of role for an actor to do. It is a shame I have found that he hasn't had a role that is extremely showy and extremely big, because that is the type of performance that usually makes people sit back and go, oh wait, you're really good at acting. Which is a shame, but it is kind of a way of how things go. We learn about actors when they do the big performances. I learned about Daniel Day-Lewis when There Will Be Blood came out, because There Will Be Blood is a huge performance, and it's a great one. But it's nowhere near his best. You look at something like Phantom Thread, for example, which is a much more reserved performance, and that is where you see, oh no, this guy's great. And I think once Yeun gets those types of roles that really let him just like chew on some good performative meat, I think he is going to be remembered for films like Burning and Minari, because people are going to watch those and go, wait, no, this guy is great. And he is here. He delivers one of the best performances of the year, no doubt, and probably would be my best actor pick if it weren't for another movie that we're going to talk about later. But that is just one aspect of Minari. What Lee Isaac Chung has done here is basically make a movie that feels descendant of things like early Terrence Malick, stuff like Badlands and Days of Heaven. Not only because it's taking place in the 1980s, Badlands and Days of Heaven were films of the 70s, so there is some of that connective tissue there, but the way that Chung moves the camera is so compelling, and so it just draws you in so naturally without ever really being about all that much. Again, and maybe it's unfair to continually compare this to Burning, another Korean film starring Steven Yeun, and this movie isn't a Korean film, it's an American film with Korean actors about the Korean-American experience, and I will say about 60 to 75% of the dialogue is in Korean and is subtitled, which is just a wonderful thing to see for American films and kind of this normalization of other cultures and other ways of speaking and using subtitles for various aspects. And that is another topic that we are going to discuss a little bit further in a future segment of today's episode. But the way that the camera moves and the way that the characters work, it is almost completely foregoing any type of narrative trope or any type of manufactured conflict that you would generally have in this type of film, that you even have in stuff like Days of Heaven. And while there are a few moments in Minari that don't totally work and aren't totally organic or totally naturalistic, as it were, which I think, while it does kind of take away from the spell that the movie cast on me, I think it is necessary because drama requires conflict, so sometimes you have to manufacture conflict, and it can't just be the little moments of kind of the beautiful peace that come in various things, like the small glances of conversation between Jacob and Monica, or the kind of back and forth cat and mouse between David and his grandmother. Those are the things that give the movie life, but ultimately it is not the things that make the movie a holistic dramatic experience, which come from the more big and showy elements. Again, there's nothing terribly wrong with that, but it does break the illusion of this immaculate perfection, so to speak. And the breaking of that perfection is something that makes this movie, at least to me, so powerful. When watching it, between both laughing a lot, because this is a very funny movie, it's a dryly funny movie, but I found this to be funnier than most of the comedies released this year. When I wasn't laughing or when I wasn't tearing up, there is a lot that this movie has to say about the American dream and about watching that dream die on the vine, and how impactful and stubbornly beautiful it can be when people say, well, I'm going to climb it up anyway. I'm going to climb up the wall. I don't care that the vine is dead. I don't care that it won't hold me. I don't care that I will probably fall and die. I have to do this. And I think it's really important when discussing films about the American dream and about the immigrant experience, which is not an experience that I have a real authority to comment on, but I took a lot of English classes, so I know a lot about the American dream as a storytelling device. So I think that having stories about the American dream that almost immediately throw away the concept that the American dream is this innate, ingrained thing, and that it is solely by virtue of people's decisions in the time that they are in, I think that's a really interesting and kind of beautiful way to return to look at this almost mythologized piece of storytelling structure. And again, this has to happen in the 80s because the American dream, really does not exist right now. Like, it didn't exist then, but it doubly doesn't exist now. But the ability to find hope in that lack is something that needed to be in the 80s. It needed to be in the American South. It needed to be this family. It needed to be these people. And that's, I think, the thing that makes Minari such a coherent and cohesive, beautiful project, just because everything feels so perfectly in place. Nothing about it is a decision that was made because they had to make a decision. It all feels interconnected, and it plays on your expectations so wonderfully and so brilliantly. There are a lot of moments, because this is in the 80s, and there was a great deal of anti-Asian sentiments going on, specifically anti-Japanese sentiments, but that extends because people don't really think about the differences, and people suck sometimes. So the movie is, I think, very intentionally playing on your fears of this turning into a story about racism. Not because that would make it a worse movie, but because, I like these characters and I like these people, and I don't want to see them have horrible racist things done to them. And so I think the movie very cleverly utilizes that and weaponizes that in a way against the viewer. It is weaponizing your expectations. It is saying, you know how these movies work. You know how stories about immigrants go. You know how stories about people trying to claw their way through the American dream can work. Now we're going to use those expectations and push it back against you and make you really realize that it's not that simple. That it's not that easy. Because it isn't. And it isn't easy or fair to say, I know how this is going to end. I know what's going to happen here. This is going to happen, and people are going to say this, and they're going to have this problem, and we're going to go, oh, wow, the 80s were bad. But no, it is much more thoughtful, and it is much more honest and genuine. There are pieces of the characters that get brought up, and at least in my viewing experience, because I watched this through the virtual film center with Lincoln Center that are showcasing some of the more notable films from this year in a truly exceptional way, because there aren't a lot of theaters that are open to show these films, which is a truly just beautiful thing that makes me feel very safe and feel still included in the community of discussing these films, even in such a dumpster fire of a year. But back to my previous point, there are aspects of this film and of these characters that are brought up, and in my viewing experience, I went, oh no, this is going to pay off in this way, and it's going to do this. I took screenwriting courses, and I'm so smart, and I know how movies work, and I'm sure this movie's going to be good, but whatever. And it is again, it's the lack. It is the inability of this movie to have things exist solely for plot purposes. And there are films where things that just happen and kind of fade away are mistakes. And ultimately, it can cripple some films. But here, the dangling threads are not dangling because they have been forgotten about. They are dangling because we, as the audience, are supposed to feel the same thing that the characters are feeling. This looming, ever-present entity of entropy that just might hit, and it might not. And when it doesn't, oh, praise the Lord, it is good. But when it does, it is tragic, and it is heart-wrenching, and it's nobody's fault. But sometimes bad things just happen. But at least you will have planted the Minari. Minari gets 9 out of 10 stars. So now, if you'll stick around, we are going to go to another film that I was lucky to see through the Lincoln Center Virtual Cinema Program, Nomadland, another big Oscar contender for this year. So stick around for that. It's going to be a good one.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
And now let's move on to another film that I saw in the Lincoln Center Virtual Cinema. And another big 2020 Oscar contender, Nomadland. Written, directed, edited, and produced by filmmaker Chloe Zhao, who previously made the film The Rider, which was a huge hit a couple years ago in the indie scene and is set to direct the new Eternals film for Marvel coming out at the end of next year, which is one of the few films coming up in the superhero space that I'm legitimately really excited for, almost exclusively because of her involvement. And after seeing Nomadland, which is based off of the nonfiction book Nomadland: Surviving America in the 21st Century by Jessica Bruder, which tells the story of a group of people, generally older, generally who lost their livelihoods in the Great Recession of 2008, just started living in vans and traveling across America. The film stars Frances McDormand as Fern, the central character who decides to embark on this kind of nomadic lifestyle and this nomadic journey. As in addition to Fern, 3 of the notable supporting characters are Linda May, Charlene Swanky, and Bob Wells, all playing fictionalized versions of themselves, as all 3 of those people are not actors. They are real-life nomads who Chloe Zhao found and decided to put in the movie. And it adds a real layer of authenticity that is truly difficult to grasp. It's truly difficult to find in a film that is this good. Like, you get a lot of movies that blend professional actors with non-professional actors. You get like the films of Harmony Korine and stuff, and a lot of them don't know how to work with non-professional actors in a way that doesn't draw attention to it. It doesn't draw attention to kind of the amateurish feel of it. And while there are some films that kind of thrive on that amateurish environment, what Zhao does here that is so interesting is framing the conversations and framing the scenes between Frances McDormand and these non-actors in a really interesting and kind of beautiful way. Letting McDormand's absolute grace as a performer, truly flexing her muscles as one of the great American actresses, kind of letting her ground these conversations and ground these scenes so that the non-actors have a much better place to work off of. I can't imagine how easy it would be, obviously not easy, but how much easier it would be to properly immerse yourself into a scene if you had someone as obscenely, obsessively talented as Frances McDormand acting alongside you. She truly is one of those performers that makes everything around her so much better, and this movie is the perfect example of that fact. You'll notice that I didn't really go into any sort of plot synopsis when talking about this film, just kind of the brief premise and then going into it, and that's because in a way somewhat similar to Minari, Nomadland doesn't really have much of a discernible plot of any kind. It is a movie about feeling, it is a movie about tone, it is a movie about existence and being and yada yada yada, and it does share a lot of similarities to Minari, the comparisons to Terrence Malick, especially early films like Days of Heaven, the discussion of the American dream and using Americana imagery, being a period piece about someone that is generally left to the wayside when talking about America as a unit. Immigrants versus people outside of working age. And seeing these two films so close together and seeing both of them as representatives of 2020 in film, because honestly, that's what the Oscars are. They are a representation of what the film community brings forth to the world. And that's also why I care so much about Oscars, honestly. It's less, oh, this movie that I didn't like won. It is, oh, for a year when people think about great movies, they're going to think of this. And I think that is a poor representation of what we, as a community of filmmakers and performers and critics and watchers, I think we can do better than that. So I just wanted to express that very quickly when talking about that there is something really odd and really poetic and really heartwarming in its own kind of bleak, sun-drenched way that films like Minari and like Nomadland are at the forefront of being representatives of what 2020 means for the film world. These quiet, almost isolated films about people trying to make it in insurmountable circumstances and forcing themselves to make drastic changes to their lives and to their surroundings, and almost being in a sort of free fall that you have to accept and hold on to, because if you don't do it, you're gonna die. We see that in Minari with the family's ballsy move to Arkansas, and we see it every single scene in Nomadland. As Fern makes the initial decision to not be tied down to anything, as she makes the decision to reject people's negative opinions of her and reject their criticisms and even their offers to help, that while are in a good place are not listening to this woman and listening to what she demands from the world and what she desires. There's just something... There is a defiance in this movie as she bounces around the American West from place to place, community to community, sometimes seeing people that we saw 20 minutes prior and say, oh, it's good to see you again, character. It's really nice that you're still around. And sometimes seeing people for a single scene before they float off into the distance. It's a movie that almost perfectly captures the very idea of going with the flow and living on the land and living with the wind in a more poetic sense. And the movie, I think, reflects that in nearly every aspect of its storytelling. It's not a movie that is strong on plot. It's not even really a movie that's strong on characters. It is A movie that rests on Frances McDormand's exceptionally capable shoulders and just lets her guide you through a portrait of this world that we live in a very empathetic and warm way. This movie feels like a hug. It feels like a knowing hug. It's not sheltering you from the world. It's saying, here is the world. It can be painful, and there is cruelty and severe injustice. But look at those mountains. Look at these people doing nice things for each other. There's something so good about the world that Nomadland thinks that we can live in. And at the end of this year, it has been really interesting seeing a couple films that have rejected cynicism in the way that so many of its contemporaries have embraced. Even looking at like the Best Picture nominees from last year, you had a film like Parasite, which, while I love it, and I think that movie's brilliant, it is an incredibly cynical film. Marriage Story has a lot of cynicism in it. Joker is just an edgy 8chan or Reddit post. We are seeing such a drastic shift so quickly from this brutal, blunt cynicism of things are bad and sometimes people can be made worse by bad circumstances, to these sweeping, empathetic, and understandable and understanding pieces of art that almost laugh at the idea that people are inherently susceptible to cruelty. Because they aren't. And that is the thing that makes Nomadland so special. This movie is not going to be my pick for Best Picture. If this were the Davey Awards, well, I mean, it'd still be pretty close because it's great. But of the movies that are most likely going to be in the conversation, my pick would still be Minari. But that doesn't mean that this movie is not absolutely worth watching as soon as it comes out. It comes out in a limited release in February, and I'm sure very soon after that it will be online, on streaming. I know a lot of the Searchlight films, formerly Fox Searchlight, are going to Hulu somewhat in tandem with their theatrical releases. So after this virtual release, there is definitely going to be ways to see this film, especially once it gets some of the Oscar attention that I'm confident that it is going to be getting. And I highly recommend you seek it out. It is R-rated for one single shot where Frances McDormand is floating down a river and she is naked. And I'm gonna be honest, it's like a Renaissance painting. It's a beautiful shot, and it is something that very accurately reflects the themes and ideas of the film through visual storytelling. That said, it's one shot, and I think that if you have inquisitive, curious young children or young people in your life, I think this is a movie that they should see. You can tell them to look away for 4 seconds. There is so much value in a movie with no antagonist, with no hatred of the world. It is angry and it is bitter about what institutions and corporations have brought to the American landscape, but it doesn't hate them. It is confused and concerned, I should say. And the exploration of that confusion and that concern is life-giving. It feels like when you talk to a young child and they ask you something that you've never thought about in your entire life, because kids are weird and they think about weird things. And for a moment, it makes you see the world in a slightly different light because you're being forced to consider something that you took for granted. And that forced recontextualization of what you thought about the world is the thing that great films are made of. And in this movie's case, it's a bit of a recontextualization on the Great Recession and on homelessness in America and on nomads and on their journeys. And I think that's something really unique and really valuable because it sneaks up on you. It doesn't say, this is a movie about the homeless crisis, and we are going to force you to empathize with all of these people because we are an important and special movie. This movie has no pretensions about its importance. It doesn't really seem to care if you watch it or if you like it or if it gets nominated for awards. It just exists. And I think Chloe Zhao's previous film getting absolutely shut out of any meaningful awards consideration because it didn't have a big star or a big distributor kind of helped with this idea and helped with pushing forward the desire to make a movie without pretense of any kind. But it does sneak up on you, and I think Nomadland is one of those movies where after watching it, and after sitting with it and reflecting on it, obviously, I think you will be a better person, just by a little bit, than you were when you started the film. And that is a very specific compliment, and I hope you read it in the same way that I am saying it, with the utmost go see this film as soon as you can. It is not my favorite of the year, but it might be the one that I, outside of my selfish desires to get people to watch the movies that I love, I think it is the most universal and most necessary film of 2020, at least that I've seen so far. I still have a little bit of catching up to do. So that was Nomadland. Nomadland gets 9 out of 10 stars. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you keep on sticking around, we are going to head on over to a review of the Amazon Prime film that is available now for you to watch on your TV boxes, Sound of Metal. So stick around for that. I'll see you then.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And let's just keep on going. So next we are going to discuss a film that premiered in the Toronto Film Festival last year and finally got its release this month. Earlier this December on Amazon Prime Instant Video, Sound of Metal, which I actually was lucky enough to see in another virtual film festival a couple of weeks ago, and I think it should be an immediate positive to this film that I still remember so many of its images so clearly. Sound of Metal stars Riz Ahmed, who has really just made this bananas awesome career out of himself. On the acting side, he's also a musician, and a rather good one at that, but he really came to prominence in films like Four Lions, where he is great, Nightcrawler, where he is great, and Venom. In Sound of Metal, Riz Ahmed plays Ruben, a heavy metal drummer and half of a duo called Blackgammon, along with the singer of the duo, Lou, his girlfriend, played by Olivia Cooke. They're doing the heavy metal life, just kind of living free, until one day, in the middle of a concert, Ruben starts to lose his hearing. He goes to a doctor and they say, yeah, you have maybe 25% of your hearing, and it is deteriorating fast, especially with the work that you do. And what follows is a kind of incredible exploration of someone discovering that they have a disability directly tied to their life, rejecting it, and then slowly being forced against their will to come to terms with it. The third lead of the film, Paul Rossi, plays the head of a deaf support group that also kind of functions as an Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous group. Because Ruben, in addition to being a heavy metal drummer who is going deaf, is also a recovering heroin addict. There's a lot going on here. And before we continue, I just want to say that in the theatrical prints of this film, they all come baked in with closed captioning. So, for those who don't know, the difference between closed captioning and subtitles is that subtitles are for a film directed at English-speaking audiences, or being released for English-speaking audiences, if a character says something not in English, in whatever way, the English subtitles are on screen. In a film like Minari, when the characters are speaking Korean to each other, subtitles are on the screen. In closed captioning, not only is the foreign dialogue, the English dialogue, but also any sound cues of any kind are also down there on the subtitles. And in the theatrical prints of this film, they all had closed captioning baked into it, because the goal was to give deaf or hard of hearing audiences and audiences without any hearing loss the exact same experience of watching the film. So to kind of bridge the gap and connect and not have anyone feel like they're watching a lesser version of the film, because it is designed, while the sound design is impeccable and is beautiful and haunting in its own way, because a lot of the movie takes place kind of inside of Ruben's head and through his eyes, the deaf version of the film is the exact same movie as the non-deaf version of the film. When I saw it through the virtual film festival, this was the version that I saw. And it was a little bit annoying at first, and I didn't totally realize what it was doing. But seeing that connective tissue, seeing there be no barrier between the parts of the film that were spoken in English and the parts of the film that were spoken in American Sign Language, of which a large amount of this film is, was a kind of eye-opening and very subtly beautiful experience. I bring this up because if you watch this movie on Amazon Prime, the default settings are to only have subtitles for the ASL sequences. The closed captioning is not automatically on, and quite frankly, the fact that there is even a version of this film available to watch that does not have closed captioning baked directly onto the film, burned onto the digital copy, is a little bit insulting and takes away a great amount of power from this movie. This movie still absolutely rules, and I would highly recommend people watch it no matter what, but I think it is incredibly disrespectful and disingenuous for a streaming platform. And I know that the whole point of streaming platforms is for everyone to have the option. And I know that there are a lot of people that do not like subtitles, myself included. But I think if a movie is trying so hard and so intentionally to bridge the gap between deaf audiences and audiences who are not hard of hearing in any way, then that should be acknowledged and that should be held true. And I am I actually didn't even realize this until a friend of mine who loves this film far more than I do. I already love it, but he loves it so much more, actually told me that this was an option. I went to go check it myself before recording this segment, and yeah. There should not be a version of this film without closed captioning. It is a part of the movie. It is an integral part of the experience, not in the plot, not even in the theme, but in the much more important, much more rare real-world application of the basic usage of video and audio to say something and hopefully alter people's perceptions about the world. And that is such a brave and difficult to describe thing that we really do not see in the modern age, because so many pieces of film are going off of a template that has been built for decades and decades, and we really don't see anything new. And that's not a bad thing. We are in a beautiful age where we have reached pretty much the full potential of what we can do with the tactile nature of cinema and the tactile nature of audio-video storytelling, and I absolutely freaking love it. But when someone does something intentionally to prove a point, that should be respected. So for the rest of this piece, I am going to tell you why you should watch Sound of Metal, but I implore you to watch Sound of Metal, turn the closed captionings on for the entire film. It is a little annoying at first. You get used to it. I think it is the thing that makes this film as special as it is. Outside of that, though, oh, this movie's so good! I mentioned previously in the Minari piece how people are saying Steven Yeun is a candidate for Best Actor for this year's Oscars. And while there are a few films such as Mank that I have not gotten around to yet, and will actually probably get to hopefully within the next week, personally, of all of the films I've seen this year, which is around 100, 110, Riz Ahmed gives the best male lead performance I've seen this whole year. He grounds this film in such realism and such pain, and despite great performances of his career in the past, I think this is easily his best work, because it is not him bolstering other performances like in Nightcrawler. It's not him leading an ensemble like in Four Lions. He has great moments with Olivia Cooke and great moments with Paul Rossi, but the moments of this movie that really stick in my head are the moments where it's just him acting, just by himself, just little things. Just, you can see all of the emotion and all of the acceptance and lack thereof washing over his face. It is an incredible performance that makes every line of dialogue that, quite frankly, some of it's a little hokey and some of it's a little on the nose, but it makes every single line flow so well and sound so real and so genuine. And this movie would be a tenth of as powerful as it was if it didn't have someone as talented and as clearly dedicated and passionate about the role in the story that this movie is telling than Riz Ahmed. And I love that. I love seeing performances this strong. And it is a little flashy, but the moments where it quiets down, both figuratively and literally, because there are full sequences of this movie that have no dialogue and are just either people communicating through American Sign Language or trying to speak English, but we're seeing it through Ruben's eyes, and so the sound is very muffled and basically inaudible. So there's so much that relies on his performance and his face. And the desperation and the fear come through in that face perfectly. And this isn't to disparage Olivia Cooke, who also gives a very good performance. I wouldn't say it's the best one of her career, but she has had a few performances that I've really, really enjoyed, so take with that what you will. But Paul Rossi, as the leader of the support group, who is so unknown that he doesn't have a Wikipedia page for me to click on and gather information, but he does a wonderful, wonderful job with his role here as the mentor kind of leading Riz Ahmed kicking and screaming into the world of properly being deaf and understanding what that means for the rest of his life. If there's any problem with Sound of Metal, it's that it might be a little too optimistic at some points. It might see the world ultimately a little better than I think the movie earns, especially in its third act, where it starts to deviate away from the things about it that work so well to try and wrap some things up in a nice little bow. But ultimately, when you've had an hour and a half that is that strong and that good at communicating the ideas and the themes, then having 30 minutes that is just fine is really not that big of a deal, all things considered. Remember Whiplash? Remember Whiplash when the final big solo happens, and if you were lucky enough to see it in a theater, which I thankfully was, that final solo, when he is just powering those drums, and then he stops, and the room is silent, and you can hear your heartbeat, and you can hear the heartbeat of the people around you, just being in that beautiful moment. That moment is one of the great pieces of cinema of this past decade for me. And while Sound of Metal is not as good a movie as Whiplash, there are moments in it that make me infuriated that I did not have the opportunity to see this in a theater with other people, to feel the silence and hear their heartbeats and become overflown with the wave of emotions and confusions and rages and beauties that this movie has to offer. I am exceptionally grateful and happy that the three films that I have talked about this episode have all been truly great in their own ways and have brought life and meaning to this year and to this year in terms of cinema going experiences. It has been nothing but an unadulterated pleasure to discuss these three films, and they all of them look to the future, and all of them look to a betterness of the world and a betterness of people that is all too rare and is unfortunately something worth absolute commendation and unfortunately worth being as valuable as it is. Sound of Metal is a, at times, loud and brash and definitely not subtle film, but it hits its notes with grace, and it is very worth your time. And again, please watch it with closed captioning on. Sound of Metal gets 8 out of 10 stars. And that's the end of the reviews for today's show. If you will stick around just a little bit longer, we are going to do a bit of a catch up with the movie industry to see what in the hell is going on there, because there is a lot of weird stuff happening in the world of producing and distributing films, and I wanted to run some of that down for y'all so that you know what's coming up and how people are responding to it. Thanks. And unfortunately, it's looking like we're going to finish off today's episode with a couple of hard truths and some difficult discussion on the future of the movie industry. So, the biggest thing that's been happening in recent memory is the announcement by Warner Brothers that their entire 2021 film slate, which includes mega hits like Suicide Squad and Dune, are all coming to HBOMax, starting with the December release of Wonder Woman 1984 coming to HBO Max and theaters simultaneously. While a lot of this is due, very obviously, to the COVID-19 pandemic and what is happening there, it is setting a weird precedent, and the decision specifically to make the entire 2021 slate guaranteed to be released on streaming day and date is a bold and specific move by Warner Brothers that says we are trying to move our content and move our films away from the process of movie theaters. And on one hand, this sucks. I love movie theaters. I always have. They are my happy place, and I miss them so much. But quite frankly, the writing has been on the wall for a very long time that movie theaters are, outside of a few very large tentpole pieces, not sustainable. I worked in one for many years, and the amount of things being produced and the ability for so many things to get passed by for the sake of huge blockbuster fare with noticeable IPs is kind of a dire reflection of the movie-going industry and of the movie creation industry. And as much as that hurts my soul to say, it's true. I don't want movie theaters to die. I love movie theaters. But I think much like vinyl, much like reading physical books, much like a lot of things, movie theaters are going to slowly become a boutique item. Which, there are differing opinions on that. Sometimes boutique items are great. As far as, like, old video games, I'm a big believer in that. I have a lot of old systems and old cartridges that barely work anymore, but I'm so proud of having those and being a part of the weird little community that tracks prices and figures out when things become discovered. I think that's beautiful. I know there are people who do that with vinyl records, and now it's looking like, to a degree, that's going to continue to happen with movie theaters. Maybe replacing the museum is more accurate. But this topic can't be discussed without bringing up the financial disaster of Tenet. And how all of the signs seem to point to Christopher Nolan specifically saying, no, this is going to be the movie that brings people back into theaters, and we have to release it in theaters, and we have to release it now. And it bombed. And I'm glad that it bombed. Theaters were not safe. They still are not safe. It is a tube filled with people sitting for 2 hours and chewing on popcorn, sitting in gross seats. I know they're gross, because I've cleaned them, and they're gross. Theaters are not safe at this point, and they were incredibly unsafe in September when Tenet was released. So the cynic and the skeptic in me does take a little bit of pride in watching that film fail as much as it does, just because there's a part of me that enjoys watching unchecked hubris get really badly checked, and for the sake of a pun, just pretend the second use of check was in the hockey term. So yeah, it does kind of look like Christopher Nolan basically put the first big nail in the coffin for movie theaters. Hubris and desire for a place in history as the messiah of the multiplex has really kind of doomed them, because Warner Brothers with DC and Disney with Marvel are the two biggest draws to the movie theater, and in addition, Star Wars. But Disney and Warner Brothers were the two companies consistently getting people in to go see their movies. Other studios had some franchises. You have an X-Men here, a Minions there, and people will go see those, and they'll watch them and come out in droves. But the only two companies that were consistently getting massive crowds that are sustainable are Disney and Warner Brothers. And with Warner Brothers bowing out, that is 30 to 40% of the giant movies. The things that movie theaters rely on and thrive on. As much as I would love to live in a world where every theater can just coast by on indie films and foreign picks and weird little experiments with the form, that's not how most people see film. It's escapism. It's not art. It's not entertainment. It's just noise and sometimes a nap. So yeah, it's looking like Christopher Nolan might have been a very big proponent in the death of movie theaters. I must confess, it's also additionally funny to me because I truly hated Tenet, but that's neither here nor there. And I didn't see it in a theater. I got it recently when it came out on digital. Don't go to a movie theater. But it brings up a lot of interesting questions about what we are going to do as a community of people that love film and want to see it grow and expand. And for a lot of people that are slightly uncomfortable with the drastic shift to personal streaming and to individual showcasings of these films. To be fair, I've never had much of a problem with it. If I can get a movie on Blu-ray, I have a kind of nice television. I live in a house with a nice television, and I have a Blu-ray player. That's all I really need. I've got good headphones to watch something on my computer if I get a screener, and my computer display is not bad at all. There are a lot of ways to properly immerse yourself in a cinematic experience at home, and I understand that and I appreciate that. But I love movie theaters. I love the weird little wonderland that you walk into when the lights go down and you're surrounded by strangers just experiencing something beautiful all at the same time. And that's going away a little bit, and I think it's going to continue to go away when it is found out that the HBOMax deal is really, really successful. Because if you give people the option to watch the biggest movie that they have to see to talk about it with their friends, if you let them watch it at home in their pajamas, yeah, they'll do just about anything for that. Even pay the exorbitant $30 Mulan fee, which apparently was profitable enough for Disney in a recent investor call to say that they are moving forward with more premium fee Disney Plus films. This is the way of the world now. And I think it will be this way for the foreseeable future, long after vaccines have been distributed and things go back to normal, whatever normal even means. But yeah, I think movie theaters as we knew them are kind of done for. And I don't think that's a terrible thing. I think it hurts and change is bad and scary, but I think it will make going to the movie theater the kind of unique, important, and vital communal experience it once was and has slowly stopped becoming. Maybe that's just me trying to be an optimist, trying to find some sort of silver lining in what is honestly a very distressing news story, but I sincerely believe that going to those boutique and specialty theaters, the Belcourt Theater in Nashville, the Music Box in Chicago, they're all great. These theaters, the theaters that I saw films at the Toronto Film Festival, the Toronto theaters are gorgeous. The New Beverly in Los Angeles, these theaters that give you that sense of waiting in line and walking into a beautiful showing of Gone with the Wind or some other movie from the past, where you walk in and you are just enchanted, and the popcorn is good, and the sodas are crisp. And it feels like home. Movie theaters feel like home to me, and I miss them a great deal, and I think an aspect of them I will be missing forever. but it has to happen. Let's be real. And hopefully with more things in an easily accessible format, it will give filmmakers and creators a better avenue to make things and get people to actually watch them. The other big thing that's been happening recently in the world of film is that Tom Cruise went crazy on people on the set of Mission Impossible 7. There is a honestly Sorkin-esque beautiful rant that has been circulating online because the audio got leaked, and it is profanity-laden and gorgeous, and it is just mwah. It's a beautiful string. It's a beautiful string of vulgarity, and I highly recommend you listen to it. There have been, and for the record, for context, the reason that Tom Cruise went bananas on these people is because they are currently filming Mission Impossible 7 under very, very strict COVID restrictions, which is the only realistic way to film a movie. You could definitely argue that there really isn't a way to realistically film a movie right now, and that is a very valid argument, an argument that I can't disagree with and might even agree with, but it is, if you're gonna do it, this is absolutely the best way to do it. Cruise caught some people breaking those restrictions and just went to town on them. And there have been a couple varying responses, and I am of two minds about this. On one hand, it is cathartic and awesome watching people get absolutely dunked on for being so careless with their lives and the lives of others. They are in a position of immense privilege to still have extremely consistent work during this time, and as to bring out the poet in me for a second, they are a part of the defibrillator of the movie industry, because right now stuff is not really being made. And seeing people that have thrown that away just get it handed to them is a really awesome feeling, and I like it a lot. On the other hand, you should never yell at your crew or your cast. You should really never yell at anyone in a work setting. And I know we've kind of normalized and to a degree romanticized, especially in some film circles, this idea of these like furious geniuses that say like, you have to do it my way. But that is abusive and not good. So then the question comes, is it worth it to break one rule to affirm the importance of another rule? Is it okay to, for a couple of minutes, abuse your power as the head of a production in order to scare people into potentially not dying, or letting other people die, or shooting down this production and forcing people to be out of work? I don't know. I think maybe. I know I would definitely make the same decisions that Tom Cruise made, but I don't know if they're the right ones. And I think, and I'm definitely guilty of this as well, getting a little too hoorah when you first hear that audio, because it is nice, and you want to say that kind of stuff to the people at the grocery store with their masks down over your nose, because the mask goes over your nose. But it might be a little more complicated than that, and maybe catharsis isn't the only factor that we have to consider here. Much like with the immediate release of, oh sweet, I don't have to leave my house, I don't have to put on pants to watch Wonder Woman on Christmas Day. Sometimes the catharsis isn't enough, and we need to consider more things. The movie industry is in a very weird place. It's in a fragile, volatile, hostile place. And I don't know what's going to come of it. All I know is I'm going to keep watching movies. And I'm going to keep talking about them with you lovely people. This has been the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I have been your host, Davey Peppers, and as always, if you would do us a great favor and give us some likes and some follows on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, that would mean a lot. And if you could write a review, that would mean even more. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and keep watching good movies. Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.